And we continue with a very important dimension, I think, something that has really to be inserted in the overall debate, with our next speaker, Dr. Mottet from FAO, United Nations. And I'll just give the floor to her immediately.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all. Thank you for the colleagues of IDEA for the invitation. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, very honored to address you today. It's hard to follow Frank, but I'm going to try and give you some global perspective on sustainability issues, and I'm going to try and move a little bit out of just the climate dimension that has been very well addressed and is going to be addressed a bit more during the day. I would like also to acknowledge some co-authors. You see some quite famous names in our little livestock world. Some are less famous, but they deserve just as much credit. So I like to start with some pictures. We saw a picture of how much a family can waste of food, what it represents when you actually see it. I like also to look at the pictures from this photographer, Peter Menzel. He went around the world and took pictures of families in different countries and their food basket for a week. And then you can look at what's in there, how much they spend and how much food they need for about a typical week of their life. I'll start with a French family. I'm from France. And you can see you have a pretty balanced food basket here, some vegetables, some fruits, and a bit of animal products here and there. You have eggs, you have some dairy products that you can see at the bottom. So let's move to the next family. This is another family. I'm not saying they're typical or representative or average, but they are families from those countries. A family from the United States with a bit more processed food and a bit more meat as well, as you can see here in the center of this picture. If we move to the Netherlands, and it's important for dairy, we can see actually the very large amount of dairy products here. It's a big part of the average diet in the Netherlands. When we go to China, we see a different food basket altogether, but we do see some animal source food as well. And you can see here, especially dairy. We know that dairy consumption is growing in Asia at the moment. And then this is another family from Chad. Probably part of the family is nomadic, with nomadic animals that take advantage of a different sort of an environment here in this part of the world. And you can see that the typical food basket has quite a diversity as well with fruits and vegetables. You see some poultry here, 2 chickens for a week. You maybe see a bit of milk here, but it's a very different diet altogether. And in Mali, we see here that we find some dairy products, less meat in this one, but again, a lot of grains. So this was just to introduce this typical slide that we like to talk about in FAO. This is the protein supply and consumption. I mean, it's a breakdown per region and per sources of protein. So you see here in blue, you see the share of milk in this consumption of protein per region. You see meat here in orange and plant protein in green. The first thing to recognize here is the very diverse levels, all sources aggregated of consumption of protein, from 57 here in Eastern Africa to 109 and 102 in Oceania and 105 in Western Europe. So very different levels of protein intake in the world and very different composition. There is a very interesting study that was published in 2014 in Nature. We're going to start with this chart here, the C chart, that puts together dietary calories and GDP. And you have all the little colors here are groups of countries. Red is group A. You have B, C, all those are different level of economic transition. And you have isolated here India and China. The first thing to see is that the higher the GDP, the more the calorie intake. the higher the calorie intake. It also applies to empty calories, and it also applies to meat. So we know this chart, we know that the higher the average GDP in a country, or the GDP per person, the higher the meat consumption is. But there are exceptions. You see obviously India here, with the GDP growth over time, but no strict correlation with the meat consumption. In China, it's the other way around. So the meat consumption grows faster compared to GDP than in other economic groups. So I think it's an interesting link to make, and not only on meat, but you see at different aspects of our diet. So the problem that Frank mentioned earlier is this one. How are we going to feed the world in 2050 when we're going to be close to 10 billion people? We're adding people at a pace that we've never seen before. It's actually concerning. How we're going to do that in the constraints that we have, which is the one of our planet Earth. We're talking more and more about planetary boundaries, and they are diverse. It's the amount of land, it's the amount of water, it's the amount of CO2 that we can put in the atmosphere, and all the different natural resources. So far, to match this demand, we've grown both yields, but also the number of animals. And I'd like to put that in perspective with the previous presentation. If we don't add animals to the picture today, we don't have a problem. But the problem is that we are adding animals. Herds are developing. We just here have mammals, so it's sheep and goats, pigs, and cattle and buffaloes. We don't have birds because they're a different scale, but they're growing as well. So at the moment, what we're doing, even though yields are increasing in some parts of the world, we're meeting this demand also, and mostly by growing the number of animals that we're farming. And if we project into the future, you may have heard about this figure that in 2050 we might need about 70% more food than today. We have a revised estimate for this, and instead of just projecting, we've looked into scenarios. So my colleagues from the economic division, that considered 3 scenarios. The business as usual, everything stays as we're doing today. A scenario where we're moving towards more sustainability, and a scenario where we're moving, on the contrary, to more stratified and less sustainable societies. And they looked into a number of commodities here, and the change here compared to what we used to do is that we included this question of feed in the calculation. So the amount of pasture and cereal in particular needed to grow the animal herd is factored in here, which was not in the previous estimates. And you see that it's a little bit lower than what we used to say from the previous publication in 2012. So we need, under business as usual, about 54% more cereals, 52% more meat, 40% more dairy. So we're a bit lower than what we used to say. It's still, however, more food in all the different commodities that we need. And you see here, you can compare business as usual compared to less or more sustainable. But the problem is that business as usual is no longer an option. They also, in the same publication, looked at the number of undernourished people. And you see that this is the situation in the past. We have the current situation here by region, number of undernourished people. So it's what we call hunger. And we're around 800 million people today. Very close to 1 in 10% in the world suffers from hunger today. And we see that under those projections in business as usual, in 2030, we're still over 600 million. So we cannot no longer continue as we are doing because we're not going to solve this problem. And we, as 194 countries in the world, we all signed to reduce this problem or to actually achieve zero hunger, which is the Sustainable Development Goal number 2. So talking about Sustainable Development Goals, this is a framework, and I'm going to try and show to you how this can be used as a framework for the dairy sector, for animal production in general, but also for the entire population to use in order to be able to reach that 10 billion people that live healthily in 2050. And the topic now, we like to say it's not anymore how to produce more in a sustainable way, but how can we make sure that the livestock sector makes its contribution to all those objectives, and how can we enhance this potential. So you see we have 17 of them, but we are not going to go into 17 different chapters now. I'm going to reduce this large amount of goals into 4 areas, and those 4 areas were the ones discussed by about 70 Ministry for Agriculture who were in Berlin in 2018, the Global Forum for Food and Agriculture. And that's how they looked at livestock and its contribution to sustainable development. So they are a very useful way to simplify a little bit those SDGs for livestock. It's about food and nutrition security, livelihoods and economic growth, health and animal welfare, and we already touched into climate, but also other questions of natural resources and how we use them. So let's start with food security and nutrition. We already know that we have over 800 million people who go on a hungry stomach every day in the world. It's actually increasing again. We were progressing in the last decade, but for 3-4 years, this number of hungry people in the world is picking up again, not only in terms of total number, but of prevalence, which is the share of the human population suffering from hunger. This is mostly due to conflicts and climate change, and there's a strong link between the two. But the picture is actually more complex than this. We say now that there are 3 burdens of malnutrition. There's hunger, there's undernourishment, which is hunger. We have malnourishment, deficits in some of the nutrients, and overnourishment, people suffering from overweight and obesity. So today we have almost as many people who are obese in the world as people who are suffering from hunger. About 630 million people are overweight or obese in the world. We have also 1 in 3 women who are suffering from anemia, 1 in 3. Deficits in iron mostly. You see here also the number and prevalence of other types of malnutrition, stunting for children, wasting, overweight for children as well, which is increasing. And the problem is that now it's not only between industrialized and developing countries. We have all those 3 burdens of malnutrition happening in the same countries. So you can find people suffering from hunger in North America, in Africa, and in the same countries, people who are malnourished or obese. Another aspect of this food security and nutrition chapter is the feed food competition. So this is a version of a paper that we produced a couple of years ago. This is the feed basket of ruminants. We have the same for livestock, where we have obviously a little bit less grass in the total because we include monogastrics in the picture. But this is what Frank mentioned earlier. You see the amount of feed that is not edible that goes into the production of ruminants. However, we still have some grains here. It's about 4% in dry matter of what the ruminants eat, but it's about 10% of global cereal production. So yes, we know that livestock eats about close to 90, let's say 86% of what livestock consume as feed is not edible for humans. But still, what they eat as edible stuff is actually important in terms of total production. The livestock sector consumes about 1/3 of cereal production. So how can we make sure that we use less of those and more of the stuff that we cannot eat as humans? And the next step in this thinking is how we make sure that we increase the efficiency in how we turn those material, whether they're edible or not, into protein, animal protein. And those are what we call the feed conversion ratios. So Jean-Louis, who is here, might argue that we should look at them the other way around. There are different conventions for this, but for us it's the kilogram of dry matter, or whatever metric for the feed, that is consumed to produce a kilogram of protein or meat. So the first thing to notice is that in terms of protein, ruminants and monogastric produce pretty much the same amount at global level today. So their contributions to animal protein supply is equivalent. And the second thing is that we put way more dry matter into ruminants to produce that protein than for monogastrics. So you see 133 kilograms of dry matter to produce 1 kilogram of protein for ruminants. But then if we look into how much of those kilos are actually from edible stuff, so cereals mostly, then the picture changes a lot, because ruminants consume a lot of grass, straw, stover, things that we don't consume ourselves. And then the next question is, how much does it represent per kilogram of meat? So you're all very interested in livestock. You probably have good references, but if I ask this question to different types of audiences, how many kilograms of cereal do we need to produce 1 kilogram of meat? Figures can go as high as 100 sometimes in the answers that I receive. But in the press, you usually see between, let's say, 10 and 20. What we found is that it's actually about 3 in average, 2.8 for ruminants and 3.2 for monogastrics. And then we looked into, well, you can add also soybean cakes. Some might argue that, okay, it's not only cereals that compete with human production, human food, but it's also soybean cakes, because a lot of soy production today is driven by the feed and not by the oil. But the picture is actually not so dramatic, especially for ruminants. When we add the soybeans, it's about 6.8 kilograms that compete with human food, compared to 20 with monogastrics. And then finally, if you look into the kilograms of edible protein in this feed, you see that we can consider that ruminants make a positive net contribution to global protein supply. They're using less plant protein that human can consume than what they produce, 0.6. So it's a positive contribution, just because they're turning protein that is in the grass or in the straw that we cannot consume into protein that we can consume. And well, we already mentioned this, but in this topic of food security and nutrition, there's the big elephant in the room, which is food waste and loss. So you have here the FAO estimates for how much of each commodity we waste or we lose along the supply chains. You see we're very close between meat and dairy. Those are estimates, and it's hard to have a global picture on this, but we're refining them. We're trying to have better estimates by regions, and we're around 20%. This is a little lower than, for example, fruits and vegetables. And you get the profile here of where this happens along the supply chain. So everything that is closer to the left is closer to production, and then is more downstream retailer, consumer. So you see, it's also not at the same stages that we waste animal food compared to fruits and vegetables. A lot of the loss and waste in fruits and vegetables happen on farm, while for animal products, it's more downstream. So as a summary for this first chapter, what are the opportunities and challenges for food nutrition and security? First, obviously, and I didn't detail all of this. I don't have time for all of those points, but those are the ones that are very important to consider. Healthy and nutritious diets, especially for what we now consider is critical, the first 1,000 days of life, including when the baby is in the womb of the mother. This nutrition part of the life is the most important. The fact that we all need we all have diverse nutritional needs, and in particular children, pregnant mothers and the elderly need different types of diets than an average person, an average man. So we cannot really find one diet to fit all. We have to consider and address the triple burden of malnutrition, hunger, undernutrition, overweight and obesity. But we didn't mention that. We also have to keep in mind the indirect contributions of the various sectors to food security, and in particular the fact that livestock contributes to plowing the land, to bring manure, fertilization, and so on. Some estimates that we have bring around 40% of total arable land being plowed and fertilized by animals. Food loss and waste we mentioned, and the feed food competition. So the big areas of action that we identify at FAO for countries to work on, the promotion of healthy and nutritious diets for all, and actions that can simultaneously and in the same places address those triple burden of malnutrition. Obviously, we need to improve the management of livestock production systems and make best use of human and inedible feed resources such as pastures, but also the waste from the agricultural supply chains, from the agri-food industry that can be used as feed for example, for pigs and chicken, and obviously work on loss and waste. The second area, and I'm going to be quicker on this one, is the one about livelihoods and economic growth. We have about 746 million people who live today with less than 1.9 US dollars per day. This is the threshold that is considered as extreme poverty. It's very close to the number of people who suffer from hunger. They might not be the same, but they're usually the same. And about half of those poor people, extreme poor people, depend directly on livestock for their livelihood. And you have here a breakdown per country and per region. So you see a very overwhelming share for Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And we also know that the livestock sector contributes to economic growth, but this is true to various extents. You have here a graph that shows different regions of the world and how much of the value in agriculture is produced by the livestock sector. So you see it varies between around 15% for Sub-Saharan Africa to close to 40% in Europe and Central Asia. And what we see is that the trend over the last, let's say, 50 years is very different between regions. So you see in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, the contribution of livestock in terms of economic value in agriculture is growing. But in other regions, it's decreasing. You have here also the pace of growth in value of the livestock sector in those different regions. And we see that it's quite high, about 3-4% a year in value of, that livestock is growing per year. So to summarize on this, and I didn't detail all of those points, but those are the important things to consider. We saw the contribution to economic growth. The role in poverty reduction and employment is usually put forward. You know, livestock is a pillar to reduce poverty. It's not as clear-cut as this, because a lot of the time small-scale farmers, poor livestock farmers, poor rural communities are excluded from this economic growth associated with livestock. So the link between growing livestock and reducing poverty is not that evident over the last 50 years. Livestock can also represent a buffer at household level, at national level. In situations of crisis, you can sell an animal and you can generate cash that can contribute to your economic wealth. So this is an important part of their role in this area of the SDGs. Obviously, there's the whole dimension of agricultural heritage and countryside stewardship. It's very important here in Europe. It's also important in other parts of the world. The question of equity, the question of how much child labor we have in agriculture and in livestock. What is considered labor? Is a child that is herding animals for a good part of the day is equitable or not? Will this child have as many chances as other children in the world? Is a very important question, and is part of the SDGs to consider, and obviously the same goes for women. So the areas of actions here, and I mentioned this before, how can we provide more evidence on this economic growth versus poverty reduction, in particular in livestock? This last point on this slide is very important. We consider that about 80% of the growth in the sector actually happened in the last decades in very large and intensified types of production system, and did not benefit to smallholders. So the question is really about creating inclusive value chains. How can we make sure that small livestock and poor livestock owners get access to the market and can benefit from this growth in demand? Another very important area, and I'm not an expert, I'm not a vet, so I'm just borrowing from my colleagues here, is the one of animal and public health. And the big topic now is antimicrobial resistance, as we all know. This is the use of antimicrobials in the livestock sector in the world. We see that some regions are more important than others, but we also see that it's a topic that concerns pretty much all countries in the world. There are some regulations put in place in Europe, for example, since 2007, and we know that to some extent some regulations can work, can contribute to limit the use of antimicrobials in livestock production, especially as growth promoters. But there's still a lot to do. Today we estimate that I think it's about 70,000 tons that goes into livestock in terms of antimicrobials, and we have about 700 million of people who die every year from resistance to antimicrobials. So it's a topic that is threatening all of us, and it's global, and we all exposed to that. This is just one of the dimensions to address for health. Those are the other ones. Obviously, the cost of animal diseases. When we have avian influenza or any other, at the moment, the problem that was mentioned earlier with pigs, this is a cost for the sector, this is a cost for society. All the animals that we discard, that we get rid of, they're not productive, and we fed them, so it's a huge cost on society. The question of foodborne diseases, and there's a very strong link between animal products and foodborne diseases. A lot of infections that we get from our food are usually vectored by animal source food. And emerging diseases, pandemic threats, and so on. The question of animal welfare, I'm not going to go into detail, but this is one area to be addressed under animal health and welfare. And we mentioned AMR. So the areas of action that we identified here, I hope you all heard about the One Health approach. This is about considering that the health of humans, of animals, and of our environment is just one health together, and they are all linked. So everything we do in one of those areas has consequences for the two other ones. And antimicrobial resistance is a very good example of that. So minimizing the use of antimicrobials, we have here as an example the FAO action plan on AMR that we're trying to promote with governments and try and move them towards less use of antimicrobials in livestock production. I think one important thing to mention is the need to work here in multi-stakeholder kind of setups. That means having not only private sector and government working together, but having the science, like what we're doing today, having scientists, experts coming into the room and explaining, giving us the evidence, having civil society with us having this discussion. And the last one is about the question of natural resources. So let's start with land. This is from the same paper as I presented before. We used basically the feed rations that we estimated and the feed conversion ratios, and we looked into how much land does that represent. Again, we broke down those figures by big species in livestock. And we also broke down this question of pastures and rangelands into what could be considered as convertible to arable land. And non-convertible. So basically those are the marginal lands that we mentioned before. The threshold can be put in different places. For us, we used some estimates that are available from FAO, but you can consider a different threshold in terms of slope or length of the growing period to consider whether it's arable or not. This is basically an assumption. So you see that we have a total amount of land used for livestock production that is quite high. Out of this, we have about 211 million hectares of cereals that are used for livestock production. And we know that about 2/3 of the pasture that is used for the animals is not convertible. So it's something that we cannot use for other types of production. But it's still, this area here is worth considering, in those scenarios where we consider different diets with consequences on land use or greenhouse gas emissions or other dimensions. Those are the figures that we could use to see how much of the arable land would be available to produce other sorts of protein sources, for example. Then there's this big picture here that is coming from The Guardian. I'm sure some of you have seen it. The question of biodiversity, which is, according to some observers, privileged observers in the media, is the next big topic after climate change. This is very, very impressive. I had no idea until I saw those pictures that if you consider the biomass of mammals, this blue share here of the slide, 60% of the biomass is livestock, so it's cattle, small ruminants, and pigs mostly. 36% are humans, and 4% of the mammal biomass is composed of wild animals. And you see with birds, it's even more important for the domestic birds that we farm. Just putting it there, because we can look into biodiversity in many other forms. For example, the diversity of the animals that we farm. The conservation of the domestic animal biodiversity is an important topic as well, especially facing climate change. You know, having breeds that can deal with drought, with heat, stress, and so on is important, and conserving those traits is very important for the livestock sector. But this has to be put next to this picture where we were growing the number of animals in the world. So we've reached a point where it's pretty compelling. Obviously, there's a question of climate change, so I'm not going to be very long on this one because, again, it was already addressed and will be in more detail. I just want to remind us with the profile of emissions from the livestock sector. So if you look at all the emissions from the life cycle, which is producing the feed, producing the fertilizers for the feed, bringing the feed to the animals, grazing, and so on, enteric fermentation we mentioned, managing the manure here, and also everything that we call post-farm gate emissions, so transport and processing of the livestock product. This is the breakdown per sources. All this share here is for the feed. Enteric methane is about 44%, everything put in CO2 equivalent over 100 years. And the manure is about 10%, and you see the post-farm gate emissions, processing and transport is very little compared to the other sources. Here we have a source that is not negligible, land use change for pasture expansion and for soy and palm production that produces feed as well for livestock, about 10% of the emissions. Those are emissions that are coming from plowing pastures or clearing forests, so it's adding, I would say, carbon to the cycle, if we consider the cycle that was presented by Frank earlier. So a picture that is, you see, we're not talking only about this, we're talking about different sources. There's not only direct emissions, but all the emissions that are associated with the life cycle of the animals. But we also know that there is a potential to reduce those emissions in all types of sectors, in all types of system of production, and in all regions. If we take here an example of small ruminant production in West Africa, with a quick estimate that we did a couple of years ago, looking into marginally increasing feed quality, grazing management, and health and husbandry, we estimated that we could reduce, in absolute terms, emissions by 27 to 41%. You see the window, the range is different from one system to another, the options available as well. But what is important is to know that there is a potential in all systems, but that will not make any difference if we grow the sector by just as much. If you reduce your emissions by half and you add the same amount of animals, then your emissions are just stable. So it's not only about improving the efficiency and improving productivity, it's also about trying to keep those numbers of animals as low as possible. This is a big table, but it's just here as a reference. From this study of projections toward 2050, the authors, they didn't only look at the impact of supply and demand on the different scenarios here on undernourishment, on prices and so on, but they also look into, where is it, the arable land here that is needed, and the herd size of the livestock. And if you look into the business as usual, you see that we estimate by 2050 that the herd size will grow by 46% under the same, I would say, rates of yield growth that we have at the moment. So we need to accelerate a bit more the progresses that we're making. But finally, about this question of climate, and this is something that we forget to mention also quite often. Basically, having animals turning some plant material into high density in nutritional terms food is obviously going to lead to more emissions per kilogram. I mean, there's no secret. You're basically, with an animal, you're condensing some plant material into more nutritious food, but obviously you're going to have more energy in terms of calories used to produce that, more greenhouse gas emissions emitted, and so on. So some authors, they looked into this. They looked into some commodities here, some different foods, and how dense they are in nutrients in terms of how much of the, let's say 15, I think the number is 15 most essential nutrients they're bringing. So they have a score of nutrient density here. You see that actually the highest score here is for cheese. And then they looked into an average of greenhouse gas emission associated with that, and they make this ratio. So how much nutrition you get from a food and how much greenhouse gas emissions you emit for the same amount of food. And this is different to what is usually reported or used in big scenarios looking at different types of diets, because usually those scenarios, they consider kilocalories and maybe protein, but they don't look into all the other sources of nutrition, iron, vitamin B12, calcium, and so on. So we need to look into more details in those scenarios into the nutrition profile of food and what is the impact of getting this nutrition from different types of food. So to summarize this last chapter, in the area of basically the environmental SDGs, we have direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions, and indirect is an important word here. Not only considering enteric methane. Land use and land degradation, water use, I didn't touch on this, but is very important. The fact that we can, and we mentioned this before, capture some of the carbon into forests and pastures, this is a very typical thing of the agricultural sectors. I mean, no other sector can claim to be able to capture carbon from the atmosphere. And resource use efficiency is definitely something that we need to work on, and the question of biodiversity. And the areas of action, and I would like to put as the first one here, to encourage production and consumption of low-carbon food. We need to address both things at the same time. We're not here only to discuss, I don't think we can avoid the demand side part of the problem anymore. It's everywhere around us, and that's why we're here today. So we need to address this. Reducing emission intensities, that means emissions per kilogram of food, and promoting productivity improvements. This is very, very much what we are already doing. But also building carbon in pastures to improving the way we manage our pastures and how we manage the grazing of our animals. An important one here, and I'm sure some other contributions today will go back to that, how we can integrate livestock better into what we now call the circular bioeconomy, using more waste from the food industry into livestock in order to use less cereals that humans can eat directly, using better the manure, losing less of the energy and nutrients that are in the manure into the environment and putting it back into the agricultural cycle. This is key to improve the efficiency. And I'd like to mention, as the last one, promote agroecology as an approach for sustainable food and agriculture. It's gaining in interest at the moment. Countries are more and more interested into how we can use ecological principles into agricultural farming and enhance the biodiversity and provision of ecosystem services provided by livestock. And so finally, this is basically like some sort of summary of all the opportunities and risks that we show quickly today, but what is important to think about is, are there trade-offs? I mean, if we address one of those areas, are we going to damage the other ones? And the answer is yes, obviously. There are also synergies. Sometimes when we work on one dimension, we're going to have benefits on another dimension simultaneously. But let's think about, for example, intensifying production. If you put more feed into a livestock farming system, maybe you're going to make it more productive, so you're going to make a better contribution to food availability, which is one dimension of food security. The others being access and two other ones. So it's not only because you're producing more food that you're going to reduce hunger, but maybe depending on where you're sourcing this feed, maybe you're going to increase greenhouse gas emissions. For example, if you're adding some deforestation, if you need more pasture, more soybean and so on, or maybe intensifying might lead to lesser conditions for in terms of animal welfare, so you're going to have a lower score in animal welfare, let's say. So it's all about multi-dimensional measurements here, and we're moving towards this. We see more and more assessments in the literature of production systems according to a variety of metrics, and not only yields, and not only greenhouse gas emissions, or not only kilocalories produced, but also, animal welfare obviously is one, but gender equity, youth employment, having secure land tenure rights is a very important part for a lot of farmers in the world. So multidimensional assessments that can reflect those 17 SDGs in how we assess the sustainability of livestock. So to conclude, how we see the livestock sector moving towards more sustainable systems in the future in FAO. We like to propose obviously the SDGs as the framework to work on this, and I'm very happy to remember that in 2016 in Rotterdam the dairy sector signed an agreement with FAO to work jointly onto these sustainable development goals, and I think Judith will later explain to us what has been done since then, what are the progresses in the sector. An important thing is to recognize the diversity of the production system and just present them not as a block. It's not one way to produce meat, not one way to produce milk, but various ways of producing and consuming. I mentioned before the importance of jointly working together in multi-stakeholder setups. And the last point, and this is really a question that I'm going to leave open because I don't have the answer either. How can we continue to provide unbiased and reliable information, as we all do today? We produce science, we have papers, we have peer review processes, but are we making a difference, really? I just learned that in France, 1 in 3 persons believe that vaccines are not safe. So we have the evidence, there's no argument against this, vaccines are safe and they're good for human health. How does it happen that people now think it's not? So can we continue producing the same evidence the same way and not making a difference in the end? We have to question ourselves about this, and I think the whole multi-stakeholder having the different constituencies around the table is a beginning, is the beginning of an answer. But really, I think this is what we need to think about today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Thank you. Questions?
Hi, James Cape, and I work in communications, so I'm a little bit of an outsider here. Before coming, thank you very much for a lovely presentation and very informative. And before coming here, I went to the BBC. You can probably hear I have an English accent. And I Googled beef just to see what would come up. And it came up a little interview they've done, and it was with several hundred English people, mostly younger people. And they were asked about saving the environment. And number 1 for this group of people came out as eat less beef. Things like don't fly or drive less or anything like that came way down the list. For some reason, there is this propaganda, or call it what you like, which seems to indicate that some of what you're saying factually in this presentation isn't actually getting communicated to people. Have you any idea why this perhaps emotional rather than rational message has become so spread about, and what do you think of it?
Thank you for this question. I'm not a communication expert. You know better about this than I do. I'm just an observer of how we try and create a narrative and we see it distorted afterwards. So I can just only relate my own experience. I think it appeals to something that's really my personal interpretation, to something that seems easier for people to do. I guess anyone from an industrialized country will find it easier to lease one less burger per week than getting rid of a car or getting rid of their vacation. It's about comfort, it's about what we see is comfortable to do or not, and what joy we take from our emissions. It's really about priorities, and I think there's this health and environment thing that has been aligned for good or worse in the media that makes people believe getting rid of some sort of food are going to make them healthier and less damageable to the environment at the same time. And even though the ratio or I would say the evidence behind is not supporting exactly the same story, it seems easier to people, I guess.
Thank you.
I liked very much your presentation. I'm Jeroen from Wervel, a Belgian NGO working on agroecology. And what I liked is also that you're the first to mention the potential of regenerative grazing in the context of making grasslands better. But there's a group called Soil for Climate. They're very active on Facebook. And they're saying that we should also use regenerative grazing to restore the health and soil carbon buildup of arable soils. So they're making the argument that we should increase soil carbon buildup through farming ruminants on arable soils. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think it's there's nothing new, I guess, in there, because for more than centuries we've had animals parked on croplands after the harvest to bring back some fertility onto the soil. We used to have the animals grazing during the day on some slopes, and then we park them during the night on the arable land so we can transfer this fertility from rangeland to arable land. I think there's nothing new in there, and it's still practiced in most places in the world. Maybe not under our types of systems here in Europe or Northern America, but it's still practiced also in the Sahel, for example, in pastoralist and agro-pastoralist systems. So I believe it's very important, and it's, I guess, captured under what we call the circular bioeconomy, how we can make better advantage of animals as also a source of fertilization and how they can contribute to soil health. There's the manure, but there's also through the grazing and the trampling, you can also get rid of some of the species that can invade abandoned pastures, for example. I was working in my PhD with INRA in the Pyrenees, and there's a lot of fern encroachment and ash tree encroachment onto abandoned pastures. And just by bringing back the animals, you can regenerate a pasture that is richer in biodiversity and in carbon than the degenerated pasture after encroachment from usually monospecies. So I would agree with that.
Good afternoon. Liam Stokes from the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK. You mentioned diversity in livestock breeds being important for resilience. We've also heard from Frank earlier about the importance of efficiency improvements and the use of genetics in pursuing that goal. In the UK, we're having a debate around, in the sheep farming sector, around whether we should be pursuing pure efficiency gains by importing, for example, genetics from New Zealand, or whether we should be working to enhance our own native breeds, which may not provide quite the same gains in efficiency, but might provide some of this resilience that you've spoken about. And I'd just be very interested in your thoughts on that subject.
It's a good question. I'm not a specialist of breeding, but I've looked into this question in order to basically prioritize between efficiency and resilience. And it's the number one example that people use usually, the breeding aspect, especially for animal production. I think there are always marginal gains in efficiency that you can make, especially in systems that are already very efficient, like in the UK. And you may not want to lose the resilience of the system just for those marginal gains. I think this graph that we saw earlier with the dairy, the milk yield per cow and the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of milk is very important. And the whole part where everything is basically the same between 3,000 and 9,000 liters per cow and per year is what I would call marginal. You know, is it really a gain to get another 200 liters per year compared to losing resistance to drought, to heat stress, to the ability to move around in a wider types of terrains, for example? I would say it's you have to make a very careful assessment for this. Is it really worth it?
Thank you. Agnès Martin from Danone. I had a question regarding the mention you have on one of your slides about lower food price. So do you really consider that the price of the food should be lower and lower in the future, knowing that what we pay in terms of price in the supermarket for food is much lower than the real cost, knowing all the externalities that we don't take into account into the price? So do you consider that we might not maybe revise the way we allocate our budget to our different expenses and dedicate more to our food?
It's a good question. I think the slide you're referring to is the one about the study towards 2050, where they had to look into the average food price in under different scenarios, because those studies are usually based on what we call partial equilibrium models. So they're economic models that, in order to estimate consumption, look into price and purchasing power. So they have to have assumptions on this. This being said, it's a very good question, and a lot of the critics that we hear now and that are more and more supported by the evidence is that our food doesn't reflect the real cost of production, because we're not factoring the cost for water, the cost for climate, the cost for biodiversity, and so on. So we basically, I heard recently a scientist saying that all the economic growth that we had in the past century, let's say, has been done to the extent of our environmental wealth. We've lost it because we were cashing on it without paying the real price. So it's something that needs to be considered. There are scenarios, there are studies that look into putting the real price if you put a price on carbon, basically, or if you put the price of the real price of water, what would be the cost of our food. I think it's a good way to increase the evidence on this. It's not as important as the diet entry point at the moment in the literature, I would say. There are more scientists, or at least they receive more attention when they look at different diets that the real cost of our resources. But also, you mentioned the share of our budget that we allocate to food. I think in Europe we're between 10 and 15% of our budget that we spend on food. I think in France it's 13, in Germany it can be 9, something like that. In some countries in sub-Saharan Africa it's around 40-50%. So it's also it's another sort of map that we can project. And there's a new notion that I heard from some students who were doing a very interesting job in cultured meat, artificial meat. And they were moving from food security to food choices, the diet question, to food privilege. You know, we are privileged that we can choose the type of food that we want, but it's not the case for most people in the world. So it's really important what you mentioned, and thank you. I think it needs to be more part of the question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.